Hello! I'm just gonna get right into it. I decided I'm going to read my books out loud, chapter by chapter, because I've had a lot of people tell me they just listen to audiobooks, and I want to provide some kind of version of that for these. So I'm just gonna go chapter by chapter, reading it out loud on my YouTube channel, so make sure to like this video and subscribe, and let's get into The Last Heir by me, Summer Sullivan. I am going to read it as best as I can and hope I don't accidentally stumble on some mistakes, but I don't think I will. Chapter 1 Abdul Orinth. Ryder was never a fan of executions. Maybe it made him less of an Arinthian, but then he didn't care about that. He never understood why the people of his country enjoyed them so much. They gathered at the gallows as if they were about to watch a sporting event. Their cheers were loud enough to shake the ground and make ears bleed. Money was wagered on so many aspects of the event. Would the neck snap, and if not, how long would it take for him to strangle there? Would they cut him down immediately, or let him hang there as a warning to others? An execution was a good source of income for the brokers around their capital city. They were infrequent, but maybe that was the reason they drew as many people as they did. Whatever the reason was, Ryder found himself at another one. The gallows of the capital rose above the crowd, high enough for even the people in the back to see. It was made of sturdy wood, with the executioner standing on the platform, his hand resting on the lever that would release the trapdoor. There was a line of guards preventing the crowd from getting too close to where the noose was. As the main advisor to the king, Ryder stood next to him on a balcony overlooking the scene, dressed in his typical execution garb, a black suit and a black hat. Today, the garb was suffering him. The sun beat down upon the gallows, and sweat was covering his entire body. He was entirely sure he might pass out. In fact, he desperately hoped it would happen. He glanced at the king. Tyrion was dressed in a light white robe made of cotton. Contrary to Ryder, he didn't look like he was going to faint from heat exhaustion. His gray hair was tied into a knot behind his head, a simple crown adorning it. The wrinkles on his face were apparent in the hot sun. The king was a short man, slightly overweight, but stood in a manner that made it known who the ruler of Orinth was. His mouth was set in a grim line as he observed the crowd that was gathered in the gallows. Ryder knew that he didn't like this any more than he himself did, but there was no other choice in his mind, no other punishment that could befit the crime that the man had committed. Ryder turned to the princess, who was standing on the other side of him. Alida was dressed in a simple green gown, her long brown hair cascading down her back in waves. She also wore a basic crown. Executions were not the time to be flashy. Alida, unlike her father, was tall and thin. Ryder was taller than she, but not by much. Her skin was fair and smooth. When he looked at the 18-year-old, he saw the queen who had died so many years ago. But when her brown eyes met his, he could see her father in her. "I don't like this," she muttered to Ryder. "I don't like this at all." She was also sweating profusely, despite her gown being sleeveless. Ryder knew that she was adamantly against capital punishment, but like him, required to attend. "I don't either," he whispered back, barely audible over the cheering crowd. "I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen." "Ryder, this is an act of war," she said firmly. "Isn't there something you can do?" Ryder shook his head at her. "Don't put me in this spot, Lita." Alida rolled her eyes and turned back to the crowd. They stood on the balcony of the castle, the one that had the best view of the hangman and his noose. Directly under them was the castle's dungeon. It was the opposite side of where most of their work occurred. The castle was huge, and this part Ryder tried to avoid the most. The dungeon and the gallows side. The death side, as Alida put it. Just when the crowd began a borderline riot, the king nodded at the captain of the guard, who in turn nodded at one of the guards down below. The guard shouted an order that was impossible to hear over the scream of the crowd. Ryder cringed as he felt the castle shake as the large gate directly under them was open. 3 guards dragged a young man out and up to the platform. The man could not have been any older than Ryder himself, perhaps 35 or 36. He wore rags, most of which were torn and hung off his body at weird angles. Ryder felt obligated to look away. The man was almost indecent. He hoped that Alida was averting her eyes. Even from the balcony, Ryder could see the man's bruises. There was dried blood almost everywhere he looked. The man was malnourished, ribs and bones poking out. It was clear that he had not been treated to the usual standards that the Arinthian dungeon typically maintained. Tyrion was not a cruel man, but this was something different. Alida elbowed him hard in the ribs. Ryder coughed. "Your Majesty, it seems to be a bit much." Tyrion turned to him, eyes glowing with rage. "Not now, Ryder. I can normally deal with your ridiculous high moral standards, but not now. So if you don't want to end up in the gallows right after this man, I suggest you not say another word. And Alida, that goes for you too." Neither said another word, but Ryder felt Alida grab his hand. Alida was the little sister he never had. They had met the day Ryder had taken a job at the palace. He was 24 when he took the job, Alida being a feisty 5-year-old who ran around the castle like she owned the place, to the dismay of her mother and the several governesses she had. Ryder was a low-level scholar who had gotten the job because of his connections. He was hired to work in the library, studying and writing and reading. Despite his many other skill sets, Ryder loved the job and every second of it. That all changed when a year later, when on a short trip to the dressmaker's with her mother, Alida was kidnapped right out of the royal carriage and went missing for hours. The king went into a complete panic, ripping the city apart to try and find the young girl, but to no avail. Ryder cursed the day he was born because he knew he was the only one who could locate her. Using some of his skills, he tracked her down to a cave outside the city. A gang of exiled wildsmen were holding her captive. Praise the gods they hadn't touched her. Their plan was to let the king dangle for a few days before hitting him with a ransom so large it would bankrupt the city. Thankfully, it didn't come to that. Ryder walked into the cave and out with a 6-year-old Alida, who had been too distracted by a doll they gave her to realize the gravity of the situation. He left behind him 7 dead bodies of wildsmen. He brought her back to the king, who at first was mildly suspicious of his newly hired scholar. Ryder simply directed him to the caves outside the city, where the 7 bodies were found. He wouldn't answer any of their prying questions, but just wished for the princess's wellness. He also begged to remain anonymous as the princess's savior. The king granted this, as well as promoting him to an advisor. 11 years later, he was still the top advisor. Only Alida knew how those 7 men were killed. She knew his secret, but he knew he could trust her to never say a word to anyone, no matter the temptation to do so. Since that day in the cave, they had grown closer and closer, especially after the queen died. It was a cross between a brother-sister relationship and a best friendship. Other times they fought like teenagers, but Ryder wouldn't hesitate to kill a single person who threatened his princess, even the king himself. He loved her more than anyone in his life. Their hands were intertwined as the prisoner was led up to the gallows. The executioner took him from the guards and wrapped the noose around his neck as the scream of the crowd grew louder. The executioner looked up at the king. With a wave of his hand, silence rolled over the crowd. The prisoner watched with dark eyes as the king began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen of the city of Abdul, citizens of Orinth, it is a tragic day. Today is not a day for celebration, but for mourning. Today we should not hear cheers, but sounds of weeping and crying. For today is the day when the first traitor to my throne is executed before your eyes. He should praise his heathen gods that I don't do worse than a simple hanging. This day is tragic because we know he is the first of many traitors. It isn't tragic that he will die, for he deserves this punishment and worse. He paused for effect before continuing. After a triumphant victory over the people of the wilds years ago, the relationship between Orinth and Antica was stronger than ever. I look to our future with hopeful eyes and open arms. Those hopes have been dashed. Months ago, a farmer on the border and his family were slaughtered by Antican soldiers because a gold mine had been found on his property that was rightly his, property he wouldn't sell. Instead of punishing those soldiers, King Graf praised them and received them with open arms back to Ilias, the capital of Antica. From that moment on, Antica has been our enemy. We hoped for peace, but alas, the man you see before you dashed those hopes once more. For 2 weeks ago today, this man, Craydune, was caught trying to leave the Orinthian border with priceless information about the whereabouts of our armies, our spies, and our secrets. In the hands of King Graf, this information would be deadly to Orinth. It would result in the deaths of many people, some whom you might hold dear. Yet this information was bound for the hands of our enemy king. It is for that reason today that this man is to meet his gods. After a week of attempting to extract information out of him, he would say nothing of what Graf wanted or if war was imminent. So we have decided it will be Orinth who makes the first move in this war. I send this message out to you, my loyal subjects. If you are able, fight with us. Fight against traitors like this man. Help us in our fight against Antica that is surely to come. Protect your husbands, wives, children, those who you hold dear to you. If not you, then who? The glory and triumph of Orinth rests in your hands. When the king stopped speaking, the crowd exploded into roars, cheers, screams of everything one could imagine. Ryder could pick out curses at the man, cheers for Orinth, more curses directed at their neighboring country of Antica. It was absolute chaos. Ryder closed his eyes as Tyrion once again let the anger of the crowd build up. This was the day he had dreaded since he had first heard about the plot in Antica. It had come out of nowhere. The relationship between the two countries had indeed been strong ever since the war in the wilds. The threat of the wild people had been imminent to both, so they sought an alliance. Together, their two armies had fought for many years in the mountains, suffering equally as many deaths and casualties before finally prevailing as the wild people retreated further into the mountains, almost to the shadow wall, and surrendered. They shared the pain of the loss, but also the sweetness of triumph. From that point on, the bond between the two countries was stronger than ever. Both economies began to flourish as they started trading. There were several joint projects that resulted in innovation for all. That was a long time ago. In the last 5 years, the relationship had crumbled. Gold had been discovered on the border between their two countries, and chaos had followed. Each thought that it was rightfully theirs. Gradually, trade had begun to stop. Travelers stopped crossing the borders. The frequent letters exchanged between the two kings ceased to be. For the last 2 years, there had been nothing but silence. Rarely did any Onticans cross into Orinth, for they were treated with mistrust and contempt. The same went for Orinthians who went into Ontica. Both countries were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen, and then it did. Months before, a farmer and his family had been found slaughtered. After investigation by Orinthians, it had been found that they were killed by Ontican nationalists who wanted the gold that was on their land, the gold they had got, leaving behind 4 rotted corpses. Ryder had waited with anticipation for an apology from Graf, as he handled most of the diplomatic functions of the kingdom, an explanation for what had happened, a reassurance that the perpetrators had been rightly punished, compensation for the next of kin, compensation for the crown. None had come, not even a single letter. It was at that time that King Tierin had ordered the army to convene and prepare. 2 weeks ago, an economic handler of the king was caught leaving the castle with detailed notes of all the whereabouts of the army, among other things. He wouldn't say a word, but Ryder had a suspicion he had been working for Ontica the entire time and finally had a chance to make it pay. But it didn't, because Ryder watched as that same man stood staring directly at the king, no fear in his eyes, rope wrapped around his neck. Alida let go of Ryder's hand, turned around, and left the balcony. The king didn't even glance at her, continuing to watch the crowd grow angrier and angrier at the man about to be hanged. The guards were pushing people back to stay away from the hangman as they surged forward, trying to get closer. Ryder took a step back, and then another, and turned to follow her. He wasn't needed there as a symbol of unity or whatever reason Tierin made him come to those things. The crowd wasn't paying attention to the king. They had only one thing on their mind: death. Alida had already disappeared, and Ryder cursed. She was fast for someone in a nice dress and shoes. The fact was, he cared about her much more than he did some execution that would most definitely result in a war. A feeling of numb panic had settled into place in his chest. He ignored it as he jogged down the hallway. He took a deep breath, stepping out of the death side and back into the regular castle. There was a certain heaviness that he felt in the death side that was never present here. Ryder had always been a fighter. He had killed before, and he knew most definitely that he would do it again. That didn't stop him from hating death, from hating the idea of death. He often woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, seeing the faces of men he had killed, seeing the faces of their wives and children, or at least illusions of them. The air of the rest of the castle felt innocent, not reeking of the stench of death. Ryder started towards the place he knew Alida would be, the castle kitchens. Sure enough, Alida sat at the long table that was in the middle of the hustle and bustle of the chefs. They paid her no mind. She had used the kitchen as a sanctuary since she was only a little girl. It was a place she knew the king wouldn't come, making it the perfect place to hide. Plus, the cooks and kitchen attendants would always give her some sort of treat, always had it on hand in case the princess came to her sanctuary. Surrounding the long table were different stoves and ovens, always in constant use. Beyond the long table was a separate room where the dishes were washed and several tables for preparation sat. It was always warm in here from the fires, and he could understand what Alida liked about it. Ryder sat down across from her. She wasn't crying, but he could see the glazed-over way her eyes got when she was trying hard not to. Alida didn't look at him, but poked and prodded at the pastry sitting in front of her. Only you could watch a bloody, broken man about to be hanged and still have an appetite, Ryder said, smiling a little. She didn't say anything or return the smile. Lida? Father's going to be upset you left during the execution. You need to remain a united front, remember? Ryder snorted. That crowd wasn't looking to see a united front. They were looking for bloodshed and gore and death. I didn't want to see it. She looked up at him, and once again he was overwhelmed at how much she looked like the late Queen Natasha, who had died 10 years ago. Neither did I. I know he deserves to die, Ryder. I really do. He betrayed some of our national secrets to Ontica, who might just be our biggest enemy right now. But it's Cray with his numbers and his boring talk during meetings about statistics. I just didn't have it in me to watch him die. And if I get in trouble with my father for it later, then so be it. I know how you feel. That stupid man helped me open up an account in the Royal Treasury for my money. It's hard to believe he's not one of us. Even harder to believe he's about to die, Ryder said quietly. I mean, for God's sake, my father adored the man. But he knows our secrets now. Exiling him wasn't an option. Keeping him locked up forever wasn't an option either. It's a small mercy my father didn't order him publicly flogged. Maybe that was his last gift to the man. Alita sighed. Ryder agreed. Any other traitor would have been beaten in public, so maybe it was. They were silent for a moment as the noises of the kitchen continued. Shouts of cooks, slamming of pots and pans, sizzle of whatever was cooking, but it seemed to be silent for the two of them. Alita took a small bite into the pastry and swallowed. Do you really think it's going to come to war, Ryder? He shook his head. I don't know. I pray to the gods it doesn't. But this stalemate, or whatever you want to call it, between us and Antica, it's been happening for almost 5 years now. Something must happen to break the ice, and that something might just be war. What do you think should happen? If you were my father, what would you do? He sighed. I would exile Cray to the wilds. He would either die or survive and make his way back to Antica. By the time he returned, his information would be null, so we would be safe. I would send a diplomatic team to the capital of Antica and settle this petty dispute once and for all, because that's really all it is, a petty dispute about gold on our borders. We could agree to split it 50-50 or trade it for something else. I don't see any reason to go to war when we could talk and figure it out without all the bloodshed. Alita didn't say anything but ripped off a piece of her pastry and popped it into her mouth. But this is about more than gold, isn't it, Ryder? Ryder stared at her. I don't know what you mean. She looked back up at him, her brown eyes gleaming. I'm not an idiot, Ryder. I know you and my father have been keeping something from me. And I know for a fact my father would not call for an entire army to defend Orinth if it was just a dispute about gold. It's more than that, and if you don't tell me, I'll just figure it out myself. Alita. He rarely called her by her full name, except when he was deadly serious. He felt the panic coursing through his body, not just a numb feeling in his chest anymore. He was wrong to ever underestimate how observant the princess was. It's none of your concern. Of course it's my concern, Ryder. I'm the one who's going to inherit the throne. She kept her voice down, but he could see the anger in her eyes directed at him. She threw her hands in the air. I thought we told each other everything, she muttered. Ryder leaned forward. Alita, please. You know I would tell you anything. You know almost everything about me. But your father, he told me I wasn't to say a word of this to anyone. He made me swear, on your life and mine. Swearing on his own life meant very little to him. Swearing on Alita's life was something different. Her eyes softened a bit, but still had her trademark intensity. If that's your excuse, then so be it, but because you swore on my life, you should tell me what this is really all about. Ryder looked around. The entire kitchen staff went about their business without even noticing them, but he knew better. Cray was only the first spy, but there could be hundreds more lingering in the castle. He couldn't tell her here. He shook his head. Not here. Maybe tonight or tomorrow at some point. Alita gave him a look. That doesn't work on me anymore, Ryder. You can't say maybe tomorrow and then expect me to forget about it. Ryder cursed under his breath. Gods help me. Fine. Tonight, let's go for a walk. At 8 o'clock. I'll meet you in the gardens. Just please make sure you aren't followed. It's important. Alita grinned at him and he couldn't help but smile back at her. Sounds good then. 8 o'clock evening walk with my favorite castle advisor. He rolled his eyes at her, still smiling. Sometimes I wish I left you in the caves all those years ago. She shook her head at him. You really have to keep bringing that up, don't you? I really do. You still owe me one, and until you pay up, I am legally obliged to keep bothering you about it. They both laughed that time, but were interrupted. Your Highness? The princess's assistant, Waylon, stood at the head of the table in a gray dress, dark hair stopping at her shoulders. Waylon acted as everything for Alita, and they had lived in the castle since she was small. The two of them had grown up together. Yes, Waylon? Alita asked. Your father would like to see you and Mr. Gray in his office immediately. I was sent to find you and relay the message. Ryder met Alita's eyes and sighed. Well, I suppose we were going to be lectured sooner or later, he said, standing up. Alita followed. Thank you, Waylon. Have some tea ready for me when this is all over. I suppose I should need it when we're done with my father. Ryder chuckled and offered his arm to the princess. Your Highness? Alita smiled at him and took it as they began towards the king's office.